So, I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine a fly lands on your arm. Just a totally normal, everyday fly.
Right, we've all been there.
Yeah, exactly. You feel that slight little tickle of its legs, you brush it away without a second thought, and you just go about your day.
You don't even process it.
You really don't. But what you don't know, what you couldn't possibly feel, actually, is that in the fraction of a second before you swatted it, that fly deposited a microscopic larva right onto your skin.
Oh, yeah. That is the stuff of nightmares.
Right. And right now, as you're sitting there listening to this, that larva is reacting to your body heat.
Yeah.
It's using these microscopic, razor-sharp hooks to literally burrow through your pores.
Just digging right in.
Digging right past the dermis. It's heading for your lymphatic system or, I don't know, maybe your spinal column. And the worst part is there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it because you don't even know it's there.
It's the ultimate biological violation, honestly. I mean, we spend our entire lives building walls, filtering our water, locking our doors to keep threats on the outside.
Yeah, keeping the bad stuff out.
Exactly. But a parasite completely bypasses all of that. It makes your own body the locked room, and it's already inside. It doesn't just consume you, you know? It intimately uses you.
It intimately uses you. That is, wow, that is a deeply unsettling reality, and that is exactly what we are taking a deep dive into today.
I am so excited for this one.
Me too. We are looking at the horrifying factual biology of parasites today, and specifically how one particular story uses that real-world science to ask a much darker question.
The big question of who the real monster is.
Yes. When you compare the instinctual, just raw horrors of the natural world to the premeditated cruelty that human beings are capable of, who is the actual monster, we are exploring this amazing intersection of Gothic horror, 19th century entomology, and Appalachian folklore found in the novel Wolfworm by T. Kingfisher.
And, you know, the author pulls off something remarkably difficult here, because it would be so easy to just invent some supernatural creature to scare the audience, right?
Just throw a ghost or a generic demon in there.
Exactly, just make up a monster. But instead, the narrative is anchored in 1899, which is this period of massive, rapid scientific discovery, and it uses completely factual insects.
The real gross stuff.
Oh, the grossest creatures like screwworms and botflies that you can literally go look up right now, though I highly, highly recommend you don't do that while you're eating.
Yeah, definitely do not Google image search this during lunch.
Good advice. Because the horror here, it doesn't come from a ghost. It comes from Darwinian evolution taken to its absolute logical and just terrifying extreme.
Totally. So let's set the stage. We are following a 33-year-old scientific illustrator named Sonia Wilson. And I kind of want to spend some time on her situation right up front because the year is 1899 and the context of being a female scientific illustrator at that time is critical.
It's everything to her character.
It really is. She isn't some wealthy aristocrat just painting pre-flowers for fun in a parlor. She was actually raised by a Quaker naturalist father.
Right, so she has a real rigorous background.
Exactly. She grew up mixing Persian blue and Hooker's green watercolors, learning this incredibly precise, unforgiving art of anatomical drawing. But her father has died. And because of the era, the 1890s, the moment he passed, she basically became entirely invisible to the scientific community.
Yeah, it mirrors the real-world marginalization of women in science during the Victorian and Edwardian eras perfectly. I mean, think of Beatrix Potter.
Oh, the Peter Rabbit author.
Yeah, most people just know her for Peter Rabbit. But she's actually a brilliant mycologist.
Wait, really? She studied fungi?
She did. She submitted these groundbreaking illustrations and research papers on the reproduction of fungi to the Linnean Society. And she was essentially patronized and completely dismissed by the male establishment.
Well, I had no idea about that.
Yeah, it's tragic. And Sonia is in that exact position. She has the skills of a top-tier scientist, but the society she lives in only sees a spinster.
So because of that, she's just been scraping by. She's teaching French and watercolors at this miserable girls' school under a tyrannical headmistress, just slowly starving.
Barely surviving.
Right. She is desperate. And out of that pure desperation, she takes a job in Chatham County, North Carolina, working for a notoriously abrasive, misanthropic entomologist named Dr. Matthias Halder.
The worst boss imaginable.
Oh, just a nightmare. And her job is to live in his isolated, creepy house and illustrate necrophagic and parasitic insects. bugs that eat dead flesh and bugs that eat living flesh.
Which is a brilliant narrative choice by Kingfisher because it requires her to be an incredibly reliable, objective observer.
Right, she can't just be squeamish.
Exactly. A scientific illustrator cannot afford to look away from something grotesque. They literally have to study the folds of a maggot's flesh, the articulation of a mandible. They have to capture reality exactly as it is, no matter how gross.
So let's talk about her arrival in North Carolina because it sets the tone so perfectly. The train drops her off at Suller Station in pitch black of evening. She just has this cardboard suitcase with her sketchbooks and less than $1 wrapped in a handkerchief to her name.
It's so bleak.
It is. She steps onto the platform and she's expecting Dr. Halder to have sent a carriage for her. But instead, she is greeted by this enormous cloth banner that says, "Home of the world-famous Chatham Rabbit." And she is immediately swarmed by a pack of feral-looking little boys.
And crucially, they aren't selling cute little souvenirs.
No. They are waving limp, dead rabbits at the train windows, shouting that they are only 3 cents apiece.
It is such a bizarre, disorienting image to open with.
Right. Sonia's just standing there looking at these dead rabbits, wondering if they're famous because they have unusually colored fur, or maybe they're giant. But no, they're literally just normal dead rabbits.
It's a hyper-local economy based entirely on death.
Yes. And she's stranded there. Halder hasn't sent anyone to pick her up. He simply forgot, or he just didn't care.
Which establishes her complete vulnerability right from the jump. She is in a totally unfamiliar environment, entirely dependent on a man who views her arrival as too insignificant to even remember.
Exactly. So the station master eventually takes pity on her, and he finds a local man named Asa Phelps, who happens to be heading in the rough direction of Halder's estate.
And Asa Phelps is quite the character.
Oh, he is a piece of work.
Yeah.
He's described as tall, gaunt, and looking like a man who hasn't smiled since before the Civil War.
Just a deeply intense guy.
Very intense. He agrees to let her ride in the back of his rickety wagon, but he explicitly states it's his quote-unquote Christian duty. So you have Sonia, this pragmatic, educated woman, rattling through the dark, deep, thready green woods of North Carolina with this grim religious zealot.
And that wagon ride gets weird fast.
It really does. Because as they're driving, Phelps casually turns to her and drops this massive warning. He tells her not to be fooled by the woods. He says, "The devil walks these woods, Miss Wilson."
And he isn't speaking metaphorically.
Not at all.
He is referencing a specific piece of deeply ingrained local folklore. He tells her they are near the devil's tramping ground.
Which, by the way, is a real legend in North Carolina.
Yeah.
If you go look it up, there is an actual spot in Chatham County, a perfectly circular, barren patch of earth in the middle of the forest where absolutely nothing grows.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. The legend says it's where the devil walks in circles at night, thinking of ways to torment humanity. People claim that if you leave an object in the circle overnight, it will be thrown violently outside the perimeter by morning. Dogs supposedly refuse to even go near it.
That is so creepy. And Phelps firmly believes this. He actually claims to have seen the devil in the flesh out there. And interestingly, he refers to the devil as a her.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, which introduces this parallel track of understanding in the narrative. We are going to see things through a cold scientific lens via Dr. Halder, but Phelps represents an older, superstitious framework. Where a biologist sees a predator or a pathogen, Phelps sees literal, biblical evil that just has to be purged.
And Sonia's reaction to this is what makes me just love her as a protagonist. She doesn't gasp or clutch her pearls or panic. She's sitting in the back of this bumpy wagon, freezing cold, listening to this guy talk about Satan wandering around North Carolina. And she basically just thinks, well, what are you supposed to say to that?
She's so unimpressed.
She really is. She was raised Quaker. She doesn't believe in physical demons wandering the woods. She just wants to get to her room and sleep.
But the room she arrives at offers very little comfort, to say the least. Dr. Halder's estate is the epitome of Southern Gothic decay. It's this massive classical structure, but the white wood is powdered with green algae. The environment is actively reclaiming the human space.
She gets there in the dark, and Mrs. Kent, the very pragmatic black housekeeper, takes her in. Mrs. Kent feeds her some hard biscuits and immediately tells Sonia, do not get your hopes up for a marriage proposal from the doctor, because he is mean as an old snake.
She warns her right away.
Yep. And then Sonia goes up to her bedroom. She wakes up the next morning, looks at the ceiling, and it's covered in white dragonflies. They are stamped right into the tin ceiling tiles. It's a beautiful detail, But then she goes to wash her face.
Right, the wash basin. She pours water from the cistern into the basin, and floating right there in her wash water is a dead, shiny green June bug.
Uh-huh.
And Mrs. Kent had explicitly warned her the night before not to drink the water without boiling it because, quote, bugs get into everything.
The implication of disease is just everywhere.
Yeah.
You have to remember, this is 1899. We are talking about an era where waterborne illnesses and mosquito-borne diseases like malaria were very real, constant threats in the American South.
Absolutely. The house is not a sanctuary at all. The boundary between the indoors and the wild is completely porous.
And yet, Sonia stays. She unpacks her paints. Because despite the decay, despite the dead bugs in her water, and despite the fact that her new boss is a complete tyrant, she finally has access to science again.
She has a purpose.
Exactly. I was looking at this dynamic, and it struck me that Sonia is essentially trapped in the 1890s version of a horrific gig economy contract.
Oh, that is such a good comparison.
Right. Like, you know that feeling when you take a terrible freelance job because you just need the money, and your boss is an absolute nightmare sending passive-aggressive emails at 2 in the morning?
We've all been there.
Sonia's doing that. But instead of bad Wi-Fi, her occupational hazards include contracting malaria, drinking contaminated water, and drawing rotting meat. And it makes you ask, at what point does putting up with a bad boss cross the line into enabling a literal mad scientist?
It's a great question. And we have to look at the psychological mechanism she uses to survive it. She compartmentalizes. She separates the toxic behavior of Dr. Halder from the work itself.
She builds a wall in her mind.
She has to. When she finally meets him, he is dismissive, he's paranoid, and he's outright cruel. He asks her, almost tauntingly, if she is squeamish about maggots.
And she practically laughs internally at that. Because before her father died, he suffered from a terrible lung condition. He was basically drowning in his own fluids. Sonia spent months cleaning up his vomit, changing soiled sheets, and dealing with the visceral reality of a decaying human body.
A jar of preserved grubs isn't going to faze her.
Not in the slightest. She looks at the specimens, and her only thought is about color mixing. Like, how much yellow ochre does she need to add to the white to capture the exact sickly pallor of a maggot's skin?
And that intense pragmatism is exactly why the horror elements of this narrative work so well.
How so?
Well, when you have a protagonist who is prone to hysteria, the audience tends to dismiss their fear. They're like, oh, she's just scared of everything. But when Sonia Wilson, a woman forged in the fires of Victorian medical caregiving and rigorous scientific observation, when she finally becomes terrified, the listener knows that the threat is profound and real.
That makes perfect sense. But before she gets terrified, she just gets frustrated. Because Halder is deeply paranoid. He locks all his notes in this massive iron safe every single night. And he actually accuses Sonia of being a corporate spy for the Megatherium Club.
Oh, the Megatherium Club. That is a fantastic historical inclusion.
Tell us about them, because they sound made up, but they aren't.
They are completely real. For those unfamiliar, it was a real informal group of young naturalists and scientists who lived in the Smithsonian Institution building the castle in Washington, D.C. during the 1850s and 60s.
They were basically a frat house of genius biologists, right?
Pretty much. They were led by guys like William Stimson and Robert Kennicott. They worked incredibly hard during the day, cataloging the massive influx of specimens coming in from Western expeditions. But at night, they drank ale, sang songs, and yes, they supposedly held sack races in the great halls of the Smithsonian.
Sack races in the Smithsonian.
Yeah, they were eventually kicked out of the castle by the administration because they were just too rowdy.
I love that so much.
It's great. But bringing them up highlights the contrast in scientific philosophy here. The Megatherium Club represents science as a joyous, collaborative, communal effort of discovery.
Right, sharing knowledge.
Exactly. But Halder represents science as an isolated, paranoid, ego-driven pursuit of dominance over nature. He is convinced these men are trying to steal his life's work.
And what is his life's work? Let's actually get into the biology now, because the subjects Sonia is forced to draw are where the true, factual horror of this deep dive really lies. She is introduced to the screwworm, Cochleomia hominivorax.
So let's break down that scientific name, Cochleomia hominivorax.
Which sounds terrifying right out of the gate.
It is. Hominivorax translates literally from Latin to man-eating.
Oh, God. Great.
Right. Because while most maggots, like your standard blowflies, are necrophagic.
I mean, they only consume dead tissue.
Exactly. They only eat necrotic flesh. But the screwworm is an obligate parasite of living flesh. The female fly seeks out any open wound on a living host, no matter how small. A tick bite, a scratch, or even naturally exposed mucous membranes like nostrils or eyes.
And the book mentions they can even lay eggs in the umbilical stumps of newborn babies if they aren't cleaned properly. It's horrifying. But it's the physical structure of the larva that gives it its name, and that Halder makes Sonia illustrate in excruciating detail.
Yeah, if you look at a screwworm larva under magnification, it isn't smooth. It has these prominent raised ridges running in a spiral down the length of its body, resembling the threads of a screw.
But why? Why would evolution design a maggot to look like a piece of hardware?
Because of the environment it lives in. A dead body doesn't fight back, but a living host has an immune response. A living host bleeds, produces pus, and attempts to flush the invader out. A living animal will scratch and bite at the wound.
So it needs to hold on.
Desperately. Those spiral ridges are covered in microscopic backward-facing spines. As the maggot consumes the living tissue, it physically twists and burrows deeper. The spines anchor it into the flesh.
Oh, I can feel that.
If you try to simply pull a screwworm out with tweezers, you will tear the host's tissue before the maggot lets go. They literally screw themselves into the muscle.
And Halder looks at these things under his microscope and calls them delightfully efficient little beasts. He points out to Sonia that if the screwworms consume enough tissue to kill the host, the larvae don't die. They just transition from eating living flesh to eating the corpse. They win either way.
His admiration for them is entirely detached from the suffering they cause. Millions of livestock and thousands of humans suffered agonizing deaths from screwworm infestations throughout history. But Halder only sees a perfect biological machine. He tells Sonia that his ultimate goal is to understand every aspect of their life cycle so that he can be the one to orchestrate their total eradication.
Which brings up a fascinating historical reality. Because Halder's dream of eradicating the screwworm, it actually happened.
Yes, it did.
But it didn't happen in 1899.
Right.
And it didn't happen through solitary paranoid research locked in a safe.
Exactly. In the 1950s, two entomologists, Edward Nippling and Raymond Bushland, developed what is now known as the sterile insect technique, or SIT.
How's that work?
Well, they realized a crucial flaw in the screwworm's armor. The female screwworm fly only mates once in her entire life.
That seems like a massive evolutionary gamble.
It is. So Nippling and Bushland hypothesized that if they could flood the wild population with sterile males, the females would mate with them, lay unfertilized eggs that would never hatch, and the population would just crash.
But how do you sterilize a fly?
They figured out how to use radiation, X-rays, and gamma rays to sterilize millions of male flies in massive breeding facilities without killing them.
The logistics of this are just mind-blowing to me. They literally loaded millions of these irradiated sterile flies into airplanes and airdropped them across the southern United States, Mexico, and Central America. Over decades, they pushed the screwworm population further and further south.
It's an incredible story.
Today, there is a biological barrier maintained at the Isthmus of Panama. They continually drop sterile flies there to ensure the screwworm never pushes back up into North America.
It is one of the greatest, most successful collaborative scientific endeavors in history. It proves that Halder's overarching goal, the eradication of a devastating parasite, was a noble and scientifically sound ambition. But it was achieved through massive collaboration and modern technology, not through a lone genius keeping secrets.
Right. And as we'll see, Halder's methods for studying these creatures are where he crosses the line from scientist to monster. But before we get to his methods, we have to talk about the other bug Sonia illustrates, because this one becomes totally central to the plot, the botfly, specifically the squirrel botfly, Cuterebro masculator.
Also known in local Appalachian vernacular as the wolfworm.
Yes, the title drop. The scientific history of this specific bug is wild, and Halder goes on an absolutely unhinged rant about it. He complains to Sonia about the entomologist who originally named it in the mid-19th century, a man named Asa Fitch.
Right, Fish gave it the species name emasculator.
Because he observed that male squirrels infected with the parasite often appeared to be missing their testicles. Fitch concluded the maggots were intentionally eating them.
Which is biologically incorrect, and it infuriates Halder to no end.
Halder is screaming that if Fitch had taken 5 minutes to actually study the anatomy, he would have realized the maggots do no such thing. The botfly larva creates a massive cyst-like swelling under the skin called a warble.
A warble, yeah.
When it infects the lower abdomen of a small animal like a squirrel, the sheer physical size of the warble forces the animal's testicles to retract into the abdominal cavity. They aren't eaten, they're just displaced by the parasite's sheer mass.
It perfectly highlights Halder's obsession with absolute pedantic accuracy over everything else. But Sonia's introduction to the botfly isn't theoretical at all. It's violently physical.
She's sitting on the balcony, painting, and she hears a heavy, low buzzing. A massive fly, over an inch long, black with rusty yellow patches, looking almost like a giant bumblebee, lands directly on her wrist.
Most people would just freak out.
Oh, I would have flailed and screamed. But because she's a professional, she doesn't swat it. She carefully traps it in an empty jar and brings it down to Halder's study.
Halder's thrilled. He takes the jar and cheerfully explains the life cycle of what she just caught. And honestly, unlike the screwworm, which seeks out open wounds, the botfly is far more insidious.
Wait, how can it be worse than seeking out open wounds?
Because of how it delivers its payload, the botfly often catches an intermediate vector, like a mosquito, midair, and glues its eggs to the mosquito's abdomen.
Oh, that's so sneaky.
Right. When the mosquito lands on a human or animal to feed, the host's body heat triggers the botfly eggs to hatch instantly. The microscopic larvae drop onto the skin and either burrow directly through the intact dermis or crawl into the puncture wound left by the mosquito.
So you think you just got a mosquito bite?
Exactly. Once inside, they anchor themselves and begin to grow, feeding on the host's lymphatic fluids and cellular debris, growing into a massive thumb-sized grub right under the skin. They maintain a small breathing hole at the surface, which they plug with their posterior spiracles.
Sonia's reaction to this is so visceral and real. The moment Halder tells her this, she realizes this massive fly was just sitting on her bare wrist. She runs back to her room, boils water, and scrubs her arms with harsh lye soap until the skin is raw and bleeding. She is terrified that microscopic larvae are already inside her, migrating through her tissue.
And Halder's reaction to her terror, he laughs. He finds her panic highly amusing. His laugh is described as sounding like a, quote, soprano donkey. He has zero empathy for her entirely rational fear of bodily violation.
And he casually uses the moment to lecture her about even more complex parasites. He starts talking about behavioral modification. He brings up the Angelexus sinensis wasp, the emerald jewel wasp.
This is a crucial philosophical pivot in the story. We're moving from parasites that simply consume flesh to parasites that hijack the nervous system.
But scientifically, how does a wasp hijack a brain? I've heard the term zombie cockroach, but what is the actual biological mechanism there?
It's an incredibly precise neurosurgical strike. When the emerald jewel wasp attacks a cockroach, it strikes twice. The first sting goes into the cockroach's thorax, hitting the prothoracic ganglion. This venom temporarily paralyzes the front legs, preventing the roach from fighting back or running away.
Okay, a localized paralytic, that makes sense. But the roach eventually recovers from that, right?
Yes, the paralysis is brief, but it buys the wasp exactly enough time for the second, much more complex sting. The wasp physically guides its stinger through the roach's neck and directly into its brain, specifically the subesophageal ganglion.
Right into the brain.
Right into it. And the second venom cocktail doesn't paralyze the roach. Instead, it acts as a highly specific neuromodulator. It blocks receptors for the neurotransmitter octopamine, which is crucial for initiating spontaneous, complex movements in insects.
So the roach isn't physically paralyzed. It's mechanically deprived of the will to move. Its escape reflex is completely deleted from its operating system.
Exactly. The wasp can then bite off half of the roach's antenna, drink some of its hemolymph, its blood, to replenish its energy, and then literally lead the docile cockroach by the remaining antenna stub back to its burrow, like a dog on a leash.
That is so wild.
The roach will wait patiently in the dark burrow while the wasp lays an egg on its abdomen, and it will remain alive and motionless for days while the hatched larva slowly consumes its internal organs, saving the vital organs for last to keep the meat fresh.
Wow. And Halder talks about this with pure reverence. He also brings up the Ophiocordyceps fungus, the one that infects carpenter ants.
Ah, yes. Another masterpiece of behavioral hijacking. The fungal spores infiltrate the ant's body and proliferate through its muscle fibers. But crucially, the fungus leaves the ant's brain largely intact while completely surrounding the muscle tissues.
It's like a biological puppet master.
Pretty much. It chemically forces the ant to leave its colony, climb to a specific height on a plant where the temperature and humidity are optimal for fungal growth, and bite down on a leaf vein with a death grip. Only then does the fungus kill the ant, consuming the rest of its tissue before a fruiting body bursts through the ant's head to rain spores down on the colony below.
Hearing Halder talk about these things is chilling, because he doesn't see cruelty. He sees flawless, cold logic. He admires the way the wasp instinctually knows to avoid the roach's vital organs to keep it alive. And as a listener, you start to realize that a man who admires the cold logic of a zombie wasp is not a man who values human life.
Not at all. And this scientific deep dive is running parallel to the local folklore, and the two are about to intersect violently. While Sonia is learning about the micromonsters under Halder's microscope, she is slowly uncovering the macromonsters lurking in the Chatham County woods.
So let's look at the folklore. It comes to Sonia in pieces. First, from Jackson, the groundsman who is married to Mrs. Kent. Jackson is a quiet man, but one day, while showing Sonia around the property, he casually mentions the history of the surrounding woods. He tells her about animals, rabbits, deer, possums being found completely drained of blood, left limp and dry in the underbrush.
Which is unusual, but a rational mind might attribute it to a predator, a cougar perhaps, or wild dogs.
Sure, but Jackson introduces a detail that breaks the cougar theory. He says humans have been found too. He talks about a woman found dead in the crook of a tree, completely drained of blood. But her clothes weren't torn, her collar was neatly unbuttoned, and the cuffs of her sleeves were carefully folded back to expose the veins.
That implies intelligence. It implies dexterity and premeditation. It's not the frenzied attack of a wild animal. Jackson mentions that the old folks in the area call them blood thieves. They describe them as entities that are smart, that feed for a while and then disappear for a season or two when the local panic gets too high, only to return years later.
Sonia tries to brush it off as a tall tale, but then she visits McKersey. And McKersey is a fantastic character. She's a Lumbee, midwife, and healer. The Lumbee tribe has a deep, complex history in North Carolina, and McKersey is presented as a woman holding generations of practical, medical, and botanical knowledge.
She's a force of nature.
She wears a dozen shawls, she knows everyone's business, and she commands absolute respect. Sonia goes to her under the guise of learning about local medicinal plants to draw, but she really wants to ask about the blood thieves.
And McKersey doesn't talk about ghosts or vampires. She talks about biology. She tells Sonia a deeply unsettling story from her time as a midwife. She was called to deliver twins, a brother and a sister, but she refers to them as 3-month babies.
Meaning they gestated in only 3 months. The mother's pregnancy was terrifyingly accelerated.
Right. McKersey describes the delivery as unnerving. The infants were large, strong, and highly aware. And when she checked their mouths to clear their airways, she made a horrific discovery. They didn't have normal, smooth infant gums. They possessed a full mouthful of needle-like translucent milk teeth.
She describes watching the infant girl pick up a chunk of hard red clay from the ground and casually chew through it like it was saltwater taffy. It is such a visceral, disturbing image. And McKersey links these unnatural, rapidly developing children directly to the blood thieves. She tells Sonia that years later, Asa Phelps, our grim wagon driver, led a vigilante mob into the woods.
The mob had tracked down 2 entities living rough, draining a deer. It is heavily implied these were the grown twins. And the mob's reaction was swift and rooted in ancient superstition. They didn't shoot them, they staked them, shot them, and buried them at a crossroads.
It's the classic vampire disposal method. But you have to wonder, how does a scientist like Sonia process this? She sits there and tries to apply her rational X-ray vision to the folklore. She thinks, okay, what is the medical reality here?
She's trying to diagnose the myth.
Exactly. If we look at history, vampire myths often stem from misunderstood diseases. Rabies causes a fear of water and biting. Pellagra causes extreme photosensitivity and dermatitis that makes the skin look like a corpse. Porphyria can cause receding gums that make teeth look longer, and severe anemia that might make someone crave blood.
Sonia assumes the locals encountered a family with a severe congenital dental deformity or a rare metabolic disorder, panicked, and executed them out of ignorance. She assumes the story of rapid gestation is just a biological impossibility exaggerated over time, a game of historical telephone.
Because biologically, accelerated healing and rapid growth come with a massive cost, right?
Absolutely. If we look at the natural world, creatures that possess incredible regenerative abilities, like the axolotl, a type of salamander that can regrow entire limbs, parts of its heart, and even sections of its brain, they pay a heavy price.
What's the trade-off?
The cellular mechanism required to rapidly divide and rebuild tissue is essentially the same mechanism that drives cancer in mammals. Mammals have evolved complex tumor suppressor genes to stop uncontrolled cellular growth, which is why we trade the ability to regrow an arm for a lower risk of spontaneous tumors.
So for a human-like creature to heal rapidly from a gunshot wound or gestate a child in 3 months, Its cellular metabolism would have to be running at a lethal overdrive.
The caloric demand would be astronomical. They couldn't survive on a normal diet. They would need a highly concentrated, incredibly nutrient-dense food source that requires almost zero digestive processing.
Like blood and lymphatic fluid.
Precisely. What Kingfisher is doing here is brilliant. She is taking the supernatural vampire myth and reverse engineering it through the lens of Darwinian evolution. These aren't undead monsters cursed by God. They are a highly specialized, predatory offshoot of humanity that has evolved to act as an obligate parasite upon Homo sapiens.
They're just another rung on the food chain.
Yes. They have the needle teeth to puncture veins, the rapid healing to survive human retaliation, and the biological requirement for blood to fuel their hypermetabolism.
But Sonia hasn't put all these pieces together yet. She still thinks it's just a ghost story. Until the empirical evidence literally scratches at her window. This is the turning point of the deep dive, the inciting incident.
It happens in the dead of night. Sonia is awakened by a frantic, rhythmic scratching at the glass door of her balcony.
She gets up, thinking maybe a branch is scraping the glass, but she sees a possum. However, it's not acting like any possum she has ever seen. Possums are famously docile. When threatened, their biological defense is an involuntary comatose state playing dead. They don't attack glass doors.
Not at all.
But this possum is standing on its hind legs, desperately grabbing the brass doorknob with its little articulated hands, frantically trying to twist it and break into her room.
And then the moonlight hits the creature's face.
It's grotesque. The possum has 3 massive, bulging tumors protruding from its skull. One is so large it has forced the possum's right eye completely shut. The skin over the tumors is stretched tight, bare, and weeping. And as Sonia stares in horror, she realizes the tumors aren't solid. She sees a dark, wet blotch at the apex of the largest swelling, and something inside the hole physically shifts and looks back at her.
It's the breathing spiracle of a massive botfly larva. The possum eventually exhausts itself, wanders off the balcony, and dies in the yard.
The next morning, Jackson finds the body. The tumors have deflated, the wolfworms have hatched and burrowed into the soil to pupate. Sonia is sickened, but Halder is ecstatic. He literally dances out to the burn pit where Jackson threw the body. He doesn't even bother bringing it to his lab. He breaks out his surgical kit right there in the dirt and begins a field autopsy.
Halder's focus is entirely on the skull. He carefully peels back the skin and muscle where the warbles were located, and he makes a crucial discovery. The botfly larvae hadn't just burrowed under the skin, they had anchored themselves against the bone, and as they grew to the size of a man's thumb, they had eroded the skull. The larvae were pressing directly against the possum's brain.
Halder realizes that the immense physical pressure on the frontal lobe is what drove the possum mad. It wasn't rabid, it was being neurologically tortured by the sheer mass of the parasite pressing against its cognitive centers.
It's a mechanical version of the zombie wasp.
Exactly. He compares it immediately to the wasp. He theorizes that the pressure altered the possum's behavior, making it desperate, aggressive, and erasing its natural instinct to play dead. It's a major scientific breakthrough for him regarding macroparasitic behavioral modification.
But for Sonia, it's a terrifying realization about the fragility of the mind. The idea that a physical invader can completely rewrite your behavior, erase your instincts, and pilot your body is deeply unsettling. And it triggers a realization about something else she has been observing.
Right, because Sonia's analytical mind has been quietly processing a series of strange events at the estate. For weeks, the Kents have been complaining about chickens disappearing from the locked coop. They assumed it was a fox. But Sonia has a window that overlooks the woods. And on several nights when she couldn't sleep, she saw a lantern moving through the trees. It was Dr. Halder.
She had watched him walk deep into the woods to an isolated, heavily reinforced shed, a shed with a thick, iron-banded door and multiple heavy padlocks. And he was carrying a live chicken.
Initially, Sonia tried to rationalize it with science. She told herself, okay, he's an entomologist who studies necrophagic insects. Maybe he's putting a chicken in a controlled environment to study the exact timeline of maggot colonization on a carcass. Or maybe he's breeding a rare species of carrion beetle. She even briefly wonders if he's doing something perverse, because the level of secrecy is so intense. Why hide a beetle experiment behind iron padlocks in the middle of the night?
Her need for empirical evidence finally overrides her caution. One afternoon, when Halder has gone into town and the Kents are busy, Sonia sneaks out to the woods to find the shed.
And she finds the door unlocked, which is a rare mistake. We find out later that Asa Phelps, who helps Halder maintain the property, left it unlatched. Sonia pulls open this heavy door, and the descent into the shed is a masterclass in building dread.
She finds a flight of steep earthen stairs leading down into complete darkness. The air rising from the basement smells intensely of damp clay, rotting meat, and a sharp metallic tang. Copper. The smell of old blood.
She lights a candle and slowly walks down. At the bottom, she steps into an inch of freezing black water that is tinged with red. The basement is essentially a root cellar, but it's been converted. In the corner is a massive pile of dead animals. Squirrels, possums, the missing chickens. They're all completely desiccated, drained of fluid.
And in the center of the room is a heavy table covered in wire mesh, like chicken wire but thicker. And lying on top of the wire mesh is the ultimate horror of the novel.
It's a human figure. It is so emaciated, so stripped of fat and muscle that it looks mummified. The skin is stretched tight over the ribs and skull like yellowed parchment. The figure's wrists and ankles are securely shackled to the heavy iron frame of the table. As Sonia approaches, her candle shaking, the figure's head slowly turns. It looks at her. It is alive. It whispers to her in a dry, rasping voice, and then she looks under the table.
This is where the biological context we discussed earlier becomes horrifyingly relevant. The wire mesh isn't just a surface, it's a sieve. The emaciated man's flesh, particularly his back and thighs, has sagged heavily through the square holes in the wire under his own weight.
Oh, this part is so hard to read.
It is. And hanging from the underside of his body, suspended in the gaps of the wire mesh, in pale, pulsating, swollen swags, are hundreds and hundreds of giant, mutated botfly larvae.
The warbles are clustered so thickly under his lower back that they form a grotesque, undulating mass the size of a man's head. Halder hasn't been breeding bugs on dead chickens. He's been using a living, breathing, conscious human being, a man we later learn is named Saul Gregor, as a living farm for parasitic insects.
It's beyond cruel.
He tosses the chickens down there so Saul can drain them of blood to stay alive, while the botflies continuously feed on Saul's flesh.
The psychological impact of this discovery shatters Sonia's ability to compartmentalize. Her rational mind violently rejects the sensory input. She drops the candle into the bloody water, plunging herself into darkness. In the pitch black, a massive, heavy fly buzzes directly against her cheek, and she completely loses her nerve. She scrambles up the stairs, sprints back to the house, and scrubs her skin raw again.
And her brain desperately tries to protect her from the trauma by offering a medical excuse. She suddenly comes down with a severe bout of malaria.
Which is a brilliant narrative device. It provides a biological smokescreen for her psychological breakdown.
She is bedridden for days, burning with malarial fever, delirious, sweating through her sheets, dreaming of wire mesh and mummified men and giant maggots. When her fever finally breaks a week later, she sits up and tries to convince herself that the shed was a hallucination. She tells herself, I was already sick. The fever was scrambling my brain. I went into a shed, I saw a pile of normal mealworms, and my subconscious projected my fears onto it.
But once she recovers her faculties, the cold, chilling logic of Halder's crime becomes inescapable, especially when viewed through the lens of the parasitology he forced her to study.
Let's pause on that for a second because it's the core of the horror. Why Saul? Why lock a man in a basement instead of just using a cow or a pig?
Because of the limitations of the host. Halder is studying obligate parasites of living flesh. If you infest a normal mammal, a pig, a dog, or a normal human with hundreds of massive botfly larvae or screwworms, the host will rapidly die from secondary bacterial infections, sepsis, or sheer systemic shock. Once the host dies, the experiment ends.
So he needed something stronger.
He needed a host that possessed an impossible immune system. He needed a subject that could heal tissue faster than the parasites could consume it, a subject that could survive massive repeated trauma without succumbing to necrosis.
He needed a blood thief. He needed one of the highly evolved predatory offshoots of humanity that McKersey described. Saul Gregor possessed the rapid cellular regeneration and hypermetabolism necessary to survive the infestation. He was the perfect, endless, renewable resource for Halder's research.
It is an absolute perversion of the scientific method. Halder encountered an extraordinary biological specimen, a missing link in human evolution, a creature of immense scientific significance, and instead of studying it, he reduced it to livestock. He stripped it of all moral consideration.
It's the exact premise of the myth of Prometheus, but stripped of all its mythical grandeur and replaced with cold Victorian surgical cruelty. Prometheus steals fire from the gods, so Zeus chains him to a rock. Every day, an eagle flies down and tears out his liver, and every night, because he is immortal, the liver regrows, only to be eaten again the next day. Halder is playing Zeus. He has chained a man with regenerative abilities to a table, and instead of an eagle, he uses botflies.
And in Halder's twisted mind, this is entirely justified. He doesn't view Saul as a human being. He views Saul as a pest, an invasive species, a natural enemy of Homo sapiens. And historically, humans have never extended moral consideration to pests. We poison rats, we irradiate screwworms, we exterminate vermin. Halder simply applied that exterminator's logic to a sentient humanoid being.
But Sonia's discovery means she can no longer hide in her compartmentalized gig economy bubble. She knows the truth, and the tension is a powder keg. And the spark that sets it off is our grim wagon driver, Asa Phelps.
Phelps has been the wild card this entire time. It turns out Phelps knew exactly what was in the shed.
He was part of the mob that killed the 3-month babies decades ago. He is deeply entrenched in the folklore. He knows Saul is down there, and he firmly believes Saul is a literal biblical demon. Halder had been using Phelps to help secure the property and supply the chickens, assuming he could control the man's zealotry.
Which is a fatal miscalculation on Halder's part. You cannot control religious fanaticism with scientific logic. Phelps's conviction that he must destroy the devil finally overrides his fear of Halder.
Phelps decides to finish the job he started years ago, but he wants a witness. He corners Sonia in the house, pulls a revolver on her, and kidnaps her at gunpoint. He drags her through the woods, ranting about hellfire and judgment, and forces her down the dark stairs into the waterlogged basement. He wants her to watch him execute the monster.
But Phelps makes a critical tactical error. He is so focused on his righteous fury that he underestimates the biology of a starving predator. He steps too close to the wire mesh table.
Saul Gregor has not been fed a chicken in days. He is emaciated, delirious from the pain of hundreds of parasites, and running on pure instinctual survival adrenaline. As Phelps steps within reach, raising the gun, Saul acts.
And he doesn't just reach out, he executes a maneuver of absolute, desperate bodily sacrifice.
Saul literally throws his upper body violently backward. The flesh on his back and thighs, which has sagged through the wire mesh and is anchored there by the massive bobfly warbles, simply tears away. He rips his own flesh off the wire, freeing himself in an explosion of gore and parasitic larvae. He lunges upward, grabs Phelps, pulls him down into the bloody water, and sinks his needle teeth into Phelps's throat.
It forces Sonia and the reader to confront the terrifying reality of what Saul is. Up until this moment, Saul has been a helpless victim, a figure of pure pity. But in an instant, he demonstrates that he is an apex predator. His biology is brutal, efficient, and lethal. He drains Phelps of his blood in seconds, absorbing the nutrients he desperately needs to kickstart his cellular regeneration.
Sonia is huddled in the corner, holding a sputtering candle, watching a man be drained of his blood. And just as Saul drops Phelps's lifeless body into the water, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs creaks open. It's Dr. Halder, and he's holding a rifle.
Halder's reaction to the scene is perhaps the most chilling moment in the narrative. He looks down at the blood, the torn flesh, the dead body of Asa Phelps, and he is completely calm. He doesn't mourn his groundskeeper. He simply assesses the situation as a laboratory containment breach.
He walks down the stairs, points the rifle at Saul, and then he turns to Sonia. And he calmly lays out his ultimate evolutionary thesis. He tries to convince Sonia that what she is seeing isn't murder, it's pest control.
Halder explains that Saul's human appearance is nothing more than an evolutionary camouflage. He compares it to aggressive mimicry in the insect world. He mentions certain species of fireflies where the female will mimic the specific mating flash pattern of a completely different firefly species. When the males of the other species approach, expecting to mate, she devours them. Halder argues that Saul's ability to speak, his human face, his apparent capacity for suffering is all just a biological lure to get close to prey.
And then Halder drops the final horrifying piece of the biological puzzle. He tells Sonia exactly how Saul's species reproduces. He says they are essentially parasitic wasps.
He asserts that the males of Saul's species do not mate with their own females. They seek out human women. They deposit their young inside the human host. The infant then gestates at an incredibly rapid rate, and upon birth, it devours the mother from the inside out, instinctively saving the vital organs for last to ensure the incubator remains fresh as long as possible.
Which perfectly, terrifyingly explains Muckersey's story. The 3-month babies with the needle teeth. They tore their way out of the human mother. Halder frames himself not as a torturer, but as a visionary savior. He tells Sonia that these creatures are the ultimate parasite on humanity. He is studying Saul's regenerative limits, his tolerance for pain, and his parasitic load, all to gather the data necessary to eradicate the entire species. He asks Sonia to join him, to use her artistic skills to help document the salvation of mankind.
And this brings us to the philosophical climax of the story, the core question: who is the monster?
It's a brilliant debate.
Yeah.
Because Saul is standing right there, wiping Phelps' blood off his chin. And Saul doesn't deny the biology. He admits that his species requires human blood. He admits the horrific reproductive cycle, but he points out a crucial difference. Saul tells Sonia that when he came of age, he tracked down his own father, the man who impregnated the mother of the 3-month babies, and he killed him. He made sure his father would never do it again.
Saul demonstrates moral agency. His biology requires predation, yes. A lion must kill a gazelle to survive. But Saul recognizes the horror of his own existence and takes steps to mitigate the suffering he causes. He has a code.
Halder, on the other hand, is a human being. He doesn't need to torture Saul to survive. He doesn't need to cultivate mutated botflies in a man's spine to eat. His cruelty is entirely a choice. It is premeditated, conscious, and driven entirely by academic narcissism disguised as altruism.
Sonia sees this with absolute clarity. She realizes that instinctual violence, while terrifying, is a mechanism of nature. But the calculated, endless torture of a sentient being for the sake of a scientific monograph is a profound moral evil.
And she makes her choice when Saul makes his move. Because Saul has one last biological trick. He bites into his own wrist to access a specialized gland, and he violently flicks his own blood and saliva directly into Halder's eyes.
It acts as a rapid-onset paralytic neurotoxin, similar to the venom of the emerald jewel wasp. Halder immediately loses motor control and drops the rifle.
Sonia dives for the gun. She scoops it out of the water. Halder screams at her to shoot Saul to kill the monster. But Sonia points the barrel directly at Halder, and she delivers the most devastating line of the book. She says, "It wasn't science, Dr. Halder. It was just you torturing some poor bastard in a hole in the ground."
She strips away all of his academic posturing and names his actions for what they truly are. It is a total rejection of his worldview.
And the justice they leave him to face is incredibly dark. Because Saul explains that the botflies Halder cultivated didn't just grow normally. Because they were gestating in a host with hyper-accelerated cellular regeneration, the parasites absorbed that energy. They mutated, they grew massive, and their life cycles accelerated. Saul tells the paralyzed Halder that the pupa in the dirt floor of the shed are already hatching. The adult flies are emerging.
And because Halder is paralyzed by the saliva, he cannot run. He cannot even swat them away. Sonia and Saul walk up the stairs, lock the heavy iron door behind them, and leave Dr. Halder in the pitch-black, waterlogged basement.
Think about the poetic justice of that moment. Here is a man who spent his entire life obsessing over necrophagic and parasitic insects. He studied them with zero empathy, viewing them as flawless machines and viewing his subjects as mere meat. And in his final hours, lying paralyzed in the dark, hearing the heavy buzzing of hundreds of giant, starving botflies emerging from the water, he finally gets to experience his life's work from the perspective of the specimen. He becomes the living ecosystem.
It is a terrifying, fitting conclusion to his arc. But the narrative doesn't end with his death. Sonia and Saul escape back to the decaying mansion, and they have to patch each other up.
The scene in the kitchen afterward is one of the most bizarre and human moments I've ever read. Saul is sitting at the table, his back a ruined landscape of torn flesh and deep, weeping craters where the warbles were attached. And Sonia, this proper Victorian illustrator, has a pair of medical tweezers. She is literally leaning over him, plunging the tweezers deep into his flesh and pulling out the wriggling thumb-sized maggots that are still embedded in his muscle.
And how do they cope with this profound trauma? They joke.
Yes. Saul is making these dry, sarcastic comments to keep himself from screaming as she rips parasites out of his spine, and Sonia is firing back with this dark, pragmatic humor. It reminds me of reading accounts from battlefield medics or ER trauma nurses. When you are standing in a room overflowing with gore and horrific injury, your brain simply cannot process the horror continually. You have to pivot to a detached, dark pragmatism. You lean into the mechanical work of survival, and you laugh so you don't shatter.
It solidifies their bond not as a romantic pairing, but as two survivors of the same tyrant. Which leads us to the aftermath and the question of how to handle Halder's legacy. Because Halder is dead, but his research, decades of detailed notes on parasitology, still exists in the safe.
And Sonia discovers the final truth about those notes and the beautiful insect illustration she had been referencing. Early in her stay, Mrs. Kent mentioned that Halder's young wife, Louisa, had run away years ago, unable to stand his cruelty. Sonia assumed Halder had drawn the exquisite anatomical plates left in the studio.
But while talking to Saul, the truth emerges. Louisa wasn't just a runaway wife. She was a brilliant illustrator, just like Sonia. In fact, she had done the vast majority of the observational work and all the illustrations for Halder's upcoming career-defining monograph.
Saul reveals that he and Louisa had fallen in love, They had planned to run away together, but Halder caught them in the woods. Halder shot Saul in the knee with a rifle, shattering the joint so his rapid healing couldn't set it right immediately, and he dragged Saul to the shed. Louisa managed to escape with the help of McKersey and the local Lumbee network, but she had to leave her life's work behind. Halder was going to publish her brilliant illustrations under his own name.
It highlights a pervasive historical reality. The uncredited labor of women acting as the invisible foundation for male scientific achievement.
So Sonia tracks Louisa down,
Mm.
and the two women devise the ultimate academic revenge.
They don't burn the notes. That would be a loss for science. Halder's observations on parasites, while obtained through horrific means, are scientifically valuable.
Instead, they find a young, polite, relatively unknown doctor in another city, a man named Ainsley, and they quietly hand the entire life's work of Dr. Matthias Halder over to him. They published the groundbreaking definitive textbook on parasitology under Dr. Ainsley's name, with full prominent credit given to Louisa for the illustrations.
And what about Halder?
They ensure his legacy is utterly erased. In the foreword of this massive, celebrated textbook, there's a single tiny footnote thanking the late Dr. Halder's widow for graciously passing along some of his preliminary notes.
For a narcissist like Halder, a man who screamed about rivals stealing his glory, who viewed himself as a titan of evolutionary biology, having his name stripped from his life's work and given to a nobody, while his wife receives the artistic glory, is a punishment that transcends his physical death in the shed. They reclaim the narrative and ensure his ego is starved forever.
It's incredibly satisfying, and it allows Sonia to secure her own future. She uses the success of the insect plates to secure a new contract. She teams up with McKersey to write and illustrate a comprehensive botanical guide to the medicinal plants of the Lumbee tribe. She escapes the toxic gig economy. She establishes her independence.
But the ending is not entirely neat or triumphant, because while Sonia is safe, the biological consequences of Halder's actions are still loose in the world.
Right. Saul recovers, but he doesn't stay. He knows that the mutated, hyper-fast botflies that hatched in the shed have escaped into the Chatham County woods. They're a corrupted, invasive species created by human interference, and they threaten the entire local ecosystem. Saul arms himself and heads out into the deep woods, committing himself to hunting down every infected animal, trying to stop an ecological disaster caused by his own abused flesh.
It leaves Sonia in a deeply complex psychological state. The epilogue frames her lingering trauma beautifully.
She writes that knowledge is a double-edged sword. Before she came to Siler Station, she was poor and marginalized, but she believed the world was generally rational. Now she is successful and independent, but she knows exactly what lurks in the dark. She still lives in the renovated mansion, but she admits that she wakes up in the middle of the night, frantically checking her own skin for the hard lump of a botfly warble.
And her perception of humanity is permanently altered.
Exactly. She says that when she rides the train into the city, she looks at the crowds of people. She looks at the polite strangers smiling at her across the aisle, and she can't help but wonder if, behind their closed lips, they are hiding a moundful of translucent, needle-like milk teeth. She is seen behind the veil of the natural world, and she can't unsee it.
Wolfworm is a masterclass in blending rigorous scientific reality with Gothic horror. It forces us to confront the fact that nature is not a peaceful, harmonious garden. It is a terrifyingly efficient engine of survival. And it serves as a stark warning that scientific curiosity, when untethered from empathy and ethics, turns the observer into a monster far worse than any parasite.
It really makes you look at the world differently. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. We talked earlier about how Sonia's situation felt like the modern gig economy. The isolation, the desperate freelance hustle, the feeling of being a nameless cog working for toxic people.
Right.
Think about our modern society. We are more connected digitally, but physically, we are more isolated than ever before. We live in massive apartment buildings where we don't know our neighbors. We pass thousands of strangers on the street every single day, keeping our heads down, wearing headphones, refusing to make eye contact. We order our food through apps delivered by people whose faces we barely even glance at.
It's a very disconnected way to live.
It is. So, if a highly evolved, human-mimicking parasite like Saul's species actually existed today, if there was a predator that perfectly blended into the background, moving quietly from city to city, taking gig jobs, treating our disconnected, lonely society as a massive, unmonitored herd of livestock, would we even notice them before it was too late?
That is a terrifying thought.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and maybe double-check your window screens tonight.